This first lecture 1 is entitled, The Key to the Soul is Within the Missing Stoppender in the Food Octave. The Food Octave is contained in Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 39, The Holy Planet Purgatory. I'm using the text from the 1950 edition with corrections. This book, written by Gurdjieff, contains all of his philosophy and is the basic Bible, you might say, of his teachings. And also In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Ouspensky. After much study, I came to the conclusion that this was a mistake by Gurdjieff. And the amazing thing is that once I replaced the stoppender by one that I felt fit, it opened up a whole new dimension of the work and impartiality, which align with the Christian concept of agape love. Hi, I'm Dylan Stevens. I've been a student of Gurdjieff all my life, since I was in my early 20s. I studied under Willem Nyland, and since then I have been on my own, but I always use as a guide the book that changed my life, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. And at this point in my life, at 71 years old, I came to the conclusion that Gurdjieff had made quite a few mistakes, and I felt that I needed to tell others what I have found, because really the whole study of man's possible evolution is ongoing. Everybody needs to add their studies and their intelligence to this issue because it is complex, of how we can get an emotional body called Bodhikeshchan and how we can get a soul. It is, after all, the highest purpose in one's life to do so. Now, the food octave is a problem because it appears to be missing stoppender number 6, which is law. And I will get to that in more detail as we go along. On page 761, he talks about 7 arisings that he has numbered with 7 centers of gravity modeled from 7 stoppenders of the fundamental cosmic Heptaparapashana. Gurdjieff says, Proto-Hari as Do, Defthit-Hari as Re, Trido-Hari as Mi, Tetrato-Hari as Fa, Pianjo-Hari as Soul, and Exio-Hari as La, and Resultserin as T. Now, this really makes no sense because clearly Exio-Hari is meant to be T or C, as can be seen in Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, where he taught Ouspensky early on in his life. And there's no doubt Exio-Hari should be at T. But even Gurdjieff indicates further down on pages 791 to 792, he calls it, this totality of cosmic substances is everywhere called Exio-Hari. This totality of their first being food, which results from the evolution in these beings' apparatuses, corresponds with its vibrations to the last stoppender of the being Heptaparapashana. And then this next one called Resultserin is, with its name, sounds like it should be the higher Do and not T. So as you see in the diagram, there is a missing place at La, and that's what I'm going to discuss here. And so it would be logical to take Exio-Hari and Resultserin and move both of them up so that they would be at position 7 and the higher Do at 8. So another way, of course, to do it would be to look at the 5th one at Soul, Pangeo-Hari, and see if this one needs to be moved up. But on page 790, it is clearly linked to Fa, Tetrato-Hari, which has the prefix root 4. Thus it is clear that the substance at La is missing. Now one would wonder why this is. Did Gurdjieff make this mistake? How could he do this? I think that it truly is a mistake, and that no one dared to question it. He was, after all, the infallible teacher and leader. And also, I think that people tend to get bored with things that are overly complex, and they never really look that closely at it. Now, the only one who would have found it as a problem would be Ouspensky, but at the time that Gurdjieff wrote Beelzebub's Tales, they had broken up, and it's debatable if Ouspensky even saw a copy of Beelzebub's Tales, or perhaps if he did, he threw it in the trash. And then again, Orage, who certainly was very literate, you would think would have caught the mistake also. So I don't know the answer to that. Then you have people like John Bennett, who is very well respected in the Gurdjieff groups, and he says, just accept it. It's meant to be at 6. He says this in his work called Talks on Beelzebub's Tales, page 99. But here I am going to say that it is a problem, and we need to find out what substance is supposed to be. So first, we need to cover definitions that are unclear or flawed in Beelzebub's Tales. The biggest problem comes from contradictory definitions of the Stoppender. There are 2 definitions for Stoppender, either the gravity center or the distance between deflections, and this has hopelessly confused the reader and even Gurdjieff. In Beelzebub's Tales, chapter 17, The Arch Absurd, this is on page 139, a Stoppender is defined as follows. And so, my boy, omnipresent Arkidinuk obtains its prime arising in space outside of the most holy Sun Absolute itself from the blending of the 3 independent forces into one, and during its further involutions, it is correspondingly changed in respect of what is called the vivifyingness of vibrations, according to its passage through what are called stoppenders or gravity centers of the fundamental cosmic sacred Heptapara-Pashanak. But then on pages 750 to 751, the first of these fundamental cosmic sacred laws, namely the law of Heptapara-Pashanak, present-day objective cosmic science, by the way, formulates in the following words: the line of the flow of forces constantly deflecting according to law and uniting again at its ends. The sacred primordial cosmic law has 7 deflections, or as is still otherwise said, 7 centers of gravity. And the distance between each of these 2 deflections or centers of gravity is called the stoppender of the sacred Heptapara-Pashanak. In the first case, it is the note itself, but the second case is really the frequency change. To see this on a piano, a normal configuration is a white keypad and a black keypad. A missing black keypad shows a change in frequency, thus between mi and fa and ti and do. Gurdjieff covered this in detail in chapter 7, page 123, in Search of the Miraculous. He showed the frequency changes between do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. He showed that there are 2 places in this octave where the increase is retarded, and one of them is between mi and fa, which is a missing black note, and the other one is between si and do, which is another missing black note. Next, we investigate Gurdjieff's numbering of stoppenders. It will be shown that he placed stoppender 5 between sol and la. In chapter 40, The Law of Heptapara-Pashanak, page 869, it is necessary at this point, in connection with the actualization of the 5th stoppender of the sacred Heptapara-Pashanak, to trace a parallel between 2 processes which externally have nothing in common with one another. Namely, in the same manner on this piano, the vibrations of a chord do not acquire a corresponding vivifying power
until they have been fused with the preceding vibrations produced, starting from the center of gravity of the totality of the vibrations of the note Sol. Using the concept that a stoppender is the gap between the centers of vibration, this section clearly shows that Sol to La corresponds to be the fifth stoppender, starting at Sol from the preceding Do, Re, Re, Mi, Fa, Fa, Sol. However, it seems to imply that its completion center of vibration is Pangyōhari, which would locate Pangyōhari at La 6, contradicting the logical sequence of the food octave, which places it at Sol 5. That Gurdjieff erred here can be confirmed by reading the preceding text from the same chapter, where the note Pangea is at Sol 5, leaving a gap at La 6, which would be the addition of the substance that I am claiming to be harmoniary. And you can see in the diagram here that Pangea Pan is fifth, where it should be. Next, I give an example of how Gurdjieff is using a stoppender as a center of gravity, not distance, on page 789. The first being food which have already evolved up to the third stoppender of the sacred Heptaparapāshanāk, and evolve together, and thus help these substances of the first being food to pass through the lower mechano-conciting middle end, to be transmuted into other definite substances, into being Tritiarhari. Since we know that the mechano-conciting middle end is between Mi and Fa, it would have to correspond to stoppender 3, counting Do Re as 1, Re to Mi as 2. But Gurdjieff is already showing that 3 has been reached. So he is clearly calling stoppender 3 the center of gravity at Mi, Do Re Mi. For purposes of clarity in this paper, I will use stoppender to be the center of gravity, and thus equivalent to Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti, and that is easier to understand anyway. The next problem that needs to be explained is that for some reason Gurdjieff called the intentionally actualized middle end Hanal Ut. And here is where it is referred to on pages 753, 754. He, common father, omni being endlessness, lengthened the stoppender between the third and fourth deflections. This same stoppender of the Heptaparapāshanāk is just that one which is called the mechano-conciting middle end. And the stoppender which he shortened is between the last deflection and the beginning of the new cycle of its completed process, by the same shortening for the purpose of facilitating the commencement of a new cycle of its completing process. He predetermined the functioning of the given stoppender to be dependent only upon the affluence of force obtained from the outside through that stoppender from the results of the action of that cosmic concentration itself, in which the completing process of this fundamental sacred law flows. And this stoppender of the sacred Heptaparapāshanāk is just that one which is still called the intentionally actualized middle end. And as regards the third stoppender, then changed in its subjective action, and which is fifth in general successivity and is called Hanal Ut, its disharmony flowed itself from the change of the two mentioned stoppenders. Since the intentionally actualized action must happen at Hanal Ut, it is misleading to place it at T when it is already too late. It seems to contradict what he taught to Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous, chapter 14, where he said that those who are able to read the wrong place know what kind of shock is necessary to pass from C to Do. You can see the X marking the two discontinuities, but a better solution to this shows the X between Sol and La and Mi and Fa. And he's suggesting that this is the correct place for those who are able to read the symbol as to what kind of shock is required for passage from C to Do. In other words, the shock has to happen between Sol and La, and from C to Do it's already too late. for the discontinuity between me and Fa. Hanol Mazel handles it on its own, and in the food octave this is the addition of air. Between Sol and La it is impressions and in search of the miraculous. That creates the force necessary to pass from Si to Do. And of course this is elaborated much better in Beelzebub's Tales, where he calls this conscious labors and intentional suffering, which begins with consciousness, or being Padog Judy. So therefore the passage between Ti and the higher Do is dependent upon the actions at Sol and La, and not Ti and Do. This disharmony in its subjective functioning, flowing from its asymmetry, so to say in relation to the whole entire completed process of the sacred Heptaparapashana, consists in the following. If the completed process of this sacred law flows in conditions where during its process there are many extraneously caused vibrations, then all its functioning gives only external results. Therefore this happens in normal personality-controlled people, not connected with their essence. But if the same process proceeds in absolute quiet without any external extraneously caused vibrations whatsoever, then all the results of the action of its functioning remain within that concentration in which it completes its process, or possess poisonous substances, shown on page 807. And for the outside, these results only become evident on direct and immediate contact with it. Gurdjieff is just having fun about monks who grow fat from storing their exioheri. And if, however, during its functioning there are neither of these two sharply opposite conditions, then the results of the action of its process usually divide themselves into the external and the internal. And this is really Gurdjieff's method of the fourth way, which is far superior to the way of the fakir, the monk, and the yogi. So oxygen at Mi and Fa begins the second octave of the body Keschan, which through conscious labors and intentional suffering can pass from Sol to La. The third octave of the soul can begin at this point, but its method is more difficult because it requires the completed octave at the higher Do to be fed by the appropriate vivifying force at Ti. This completed higher Do is the God within that can insist the passage of the third octave, Mi to Fa. This imperfect construction of God within leads to the constant readjustment of the God within that is required to align with the prime source. This is the need for the holy planet Purgatory. For now we will just concentrate on the first octave, although there are clearly two other octaves that have formed. One is the Keschanian body and the other is the soul. The next problem is the use of cerebrum and cerebellum, which appear to be in the wrong order. In Beelzebub's Tales, page 790, he has Fa, 4 Tetirheri. He calls it the hemispheres of the head brain. Now this would be obviously the cerebrum. And on page 791, he has Sol 5 Panchirheri, the cerebellum, which in beings is also located in the head. Now cerebrum is more important than cerebellum, the automatic functioning. Or that would say that zombies go to heaven. To remember oneself by using that which was automated inside, in the cerebellum, would be clearly futile. Being Padog Judy requires the cerebrum at Sol, and also, as I will show, the hormonal energies at La, such as the third eye or the pituitary gland. I have to laugh to think that it would be the cerebellum that would be used. One could almost think that this is a joke by Gurdjieff. For those people who think they are working on themselves when merely they are completely unaware of their actions. They are just doing things that they learnt before and calling it being Padog Judy. But anyway, I think it comes from the misunderstanding of what the brain functions were in the time that Gurdjieff wrote his work. So now we get to the goal of the analysis. At this point we have 1 proteoheri, 2 tetrateoheri, 3 triteoheri, 4 tetrateoheri, 5 progenidoheri, 6 incorrectly left out, in which I am going to insert harmoniary, 7 exioheri, which was at 6 but is clearly 7, and 8 resultsaren, which was 7 but is clearly 8, as converted exioheri. So just to look at the 2 diagrams, we see that we do have an answer to what is law, and it is contained in Search of the Miraculous.
Gurdjieff never said what hydrogens corresponded to which organ in the food octave, although they did pry out of him the one at T, which was the sex center. But interestingly, Ouspensky on his own almost came up with the right answer, where he aligned the Enneagram points with the different systems in the physical body, and he had the endocrine system at law associated with exioheri at T. And also, strangely, it is the same reverse that Gurdjieff had with the cerebellum and the cerebrum.
But first we should compare each of the vibrations of the food octave with his teachings to Ouspensky from 1915 that's contained in Search of the Miraculous. The 2 sets of diagrams are a perfect match until the missing law, and they also match up at T. And I believe that the way to do this is to compare each of the substances in Beelzebub's Tales with the substances in Search of the Miraculous, when he taught this to Ouspensky. And in Chapter 9, the table of hydrogens and their production in the food octave, there is a good parallel to all of these vibrations, and they are related to the food octave. So certainly very valuable to compare. Although the strange use of oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon is obviously a relationship to the law of 3, but those substances are kind of meaningless. In the structure in Search of the Miraculous, it shows a 3-storied structure, which is very helpful. The upper floor is the head, the middle floor is the chest, and the bottom floor is the back and the lower part of the body. And this helps to associate them with the organ in which they relate to. So these hydrogens are labeled as to density, so that food is at 768, and the highest one at the sex center is 12 at T. The mechanism for the building of each substance is by means of the law of 3, similar to Beelzebub's Tales, page 751. The higher blends with the lower in order to actualize the middle, and thus becomes either higher for the preceding lower or lower for the succeeding higher. On page 787. So the first point is Do in the food octave. Do 1 proteoheri. And Ouspensky has it as H, hydrogen 768, and he has it located in the lower stomach spine story. Page 786 to 787, Gurdjieff says, from there, this totality which has the gravity center vibration of being proteoheri, passing thanks only to the process of Hahn-Meisel over the whole of what is called the intestinal tract, and gradually evolving, completely acquires, in consequence, corresponding vibrations, and is this time completely transmuted into what is called the duodenum, into being tetrateoheri, which is Ouspensky's H384, and he has it located in the lower stomach spine story. So we get to Me 3 triteoheri, and the description on page 787 to 788, Gurdjieff says, further, a part of these definite substances of being defiatory go to serve the planetary body itself and also the local hormonal nasal in respect to the newly entering food, but the other part also by means of the process of homonasal, of local character, continues its independent evolution and is ultimately transmitted in beings into still higher definite substances, which is called this time being Trityoheri. And this totality of cosmic substances temporarily crystallized in the common presences of being apparatuses which correspond to their vibrations to being Trityoheri, have the gravity center place of their concentration in the presences of the beings in what is called the liver. And it is just this place of the being Anaspalazar that the lower midline of the sacred Heptaparshnok located, called the mechano-siding midline, and the substance of the being Trityoheri cannot only by the process of homonasal independently evolve further.
And this corresponds to H192. With the addition of air, it is in the middle story, obviously the lungs and the liver.
So then we get to far 5 being Tetratoheri. On page 790, Gurdjieff says, "Now we shall continue to investigate just how, according to the sacred Heptaparshnok, the further completed process of the transformation of the substances of their first being food proceeds in the presences of being apparatuses. And so, the ordinary first being food is thus gradually transmitted into beings, the definite substances called being Tetratoheri, which have in beings, just as, of course, in your favorites, as a central place of their concentration, both of what are called the hemispheres of the head brain, which I have swapped with Pangyoheri 5, and thus it should read, the cerebellum, which in beings is also located in the head." Spensky has it as
H96.
and you'll note that Spensky has this in the middle chest story, which is acceptable with the spinal column. And then we get to Soul 5, Pangyoheri. In page 790 to 791, further a part of this being Tetryoheri, and we leave out from both hemispheres, goes unchanged to serve the planetary body of the given being, but the other part, having in itself all the possibilities for independent evolution, continues to evolve without any help coming from outside, and mixing again by means of the process of homonasal with previously formed higher substances already present in beings. It is gradually transmitted into still higher definite active elements called Pangyoheri, and these substances have as their central place in the concentrations of the beings is what is called cyanurium, or as your favorites call this part of their planetary body, which I've swapped already, with 4 Tetryoheri. It is the hemispheres of the head brain. That is the cerebrum, which Ouspensky has H48, and it is in the head story. So now we are on the final missing substance, Law 6, which I am calling Harmonieri. Ouspensky has it in the middle chest story, and it's H24. Which lends credence to my concept that it is the hormonal system, the endocrine system, the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis centered in the chest. Although this position is missing, there is a paragraph that seems to hint at what this note law is. On page 791, he says, "Just these same substances and beings, according to the 5th deflection of the sacred Heptaparshnok, have the free possibility of giving, in the manifestations of the common presences of 3-brain beings, results not similar but opposite to each other. That is why, in respect of these being substances, the beings themselves must always be very, very much on guard in order to avoid undesirable consequences for their entire whole. From the cerebrum of beings, which I've swapped already, part of these definite substances also goes to serve the planetary body itself, but the other part, passing in a particular way through the nerve nodes of the spine and the breast is concentrated in beings of the male sex in what is called testes, and in beings of the female sex in what the favorites call ovaries, which are the place of concentration in the common presences of beings of being exioheri, which is for the beings themselves their most sacred possession. You should know that this particular way is called Trinla. And so this, I believe, is hinting at the concept that it is the hormones that connect the cerebrum with the sex organs, and surely there is a connection in reality, because there cannot be any kind of growth to adolescence from childhood without the hormones, and there certainly can be no way to have these parts function without the hormones. They control everything. And you'll notice that in Search of the Miraculous, it is in the middle story, and suggests also that it is part of the heart too, concept of the heart being of the heart. So finally is T7 exioheri, which is H12, and is now in the stomach spine story where the sexual organs are. And in Search of the Miraculous, page 262 and 263, hydrogen C12 is the hydrogen which represents the final product of the transformation of food in the human organism. This is the matter with which sex works and which sex manufactures. It is the seed or fruit, and when all the cells of the physical body, sufficiently saturated, the matter of C12 begins to crystallize. The crystallization of this matter constitutes the formation of the astral body.
Now, once one is ready to accept that Gurdjieff was limited by medical information at the time, such as the functioning parts of the brain discussed previously, it is also possible to further expand the stomach-duodenum connection, defined as the notes Do and Re. This stomach-duodenum connection of Gurdjieff seems to unduly emphasize the stomach in the food octave, and might just be a fudge for an unknown organ. Current science is now becoming aware of the stomach-spleen interaction that has already been known by traditional Chinese medicine. The case is made that the stomach-spleen connection is essential for the transmission of the food substances into the brain and the creation of the Chinese concept of qi. What is proposed now is that this stomach-spleen interaction is like a second brain. The stomach is now being recognized as an entire ecosystem of bacteria, together with a vast neural network comprising some 100 million neurons, much more than the spinal cord. Of course, this is not a thinking brain. It does not reason, write poetry, or solve complex mathematical equations, but mounting evidence suggests that the health of our gut strongly influences our mood. Think about our desire to bring happiness by eating cake, ice cream, candy, and potato chips, the bane of all dieting. This stomach mind is the great saboteur of attempts to stay at an optimal weight. Compare this with the conscious mind in the brain that seeks daydreaming over conscious reality. The new theory is that the stomach governs the down-bearing function and the spleen governs the up-bearing. This sounds like negative and positive forces of Triamazikamno at work, with the neutralizing force being the liver at the next position me, which then of course combines with the air in the lungs to pass through the mechano-conciting midline automatically. It is therefore a perfect fit to replace Gurdjieff's duodenum with the spleen. So in this diagram, Protioheri Do is the same. Tefertioheri Re is now spleen instead of the duodenum.
Tritioheri
Me is the liver, that's the same. The mechano-conciting midline is next, with the air in the lungs the same. Tetratioheri Fa is the cerebellum, as opposed to Gurdjieff's concept of cerebrum.
Pangyohari, soul, is cerebrum as opposed to Gurdjieff's cerebellum. Then there's the intentionally actualized midline, which is being Patag Judy, as opposed to Gurdjieff's Hanal Ut as being Patag Judy. Then there's harmoniary, the endocrine system at La, which I have supplied, which is missing in Gurdjieff, which is this word TRNLVA, perhaps. And then there's Exiohari at T, which is the same as Gurdjieff. And now the final diagram is here.
The food octave. Starting with the ascending fourth stopender of the fundamental cosmic Heptaparapashnak is the digestive system, which is made up of the stomach and the spleen, then the circulatory system in the liver, the nervous system in the cerebellum, the thinking system in the cerebrum, the endocrine system, hormones, and in parentheses, heart, La, the reproductive system, and the sexual organs. And then this passes to the ascending fifth stopender of the fundamental common cosmic Heptaparapashnak, to the Hayado, which is God. So that's the end of the food octave. Now it is interesting to see the different parallels with the 7 cosmoses and the being foods and the radiations. And there's quite an interesting similarity in the sense that Protiohari in the stomach is really aligned with Protocosmos, the Holy Sun, and Defertocosmos for second order sun, Defiteri Defertocosmos, second order suns, Tritiohari, liver and lungs, Tritocosmos, Tetratohari, the cerebellum, appears to match up with Microcosmos if you reverse Tetrocosmos and Microcosmos, which I think makes more sense because now that I've reversed cerebellum and cerebrum, Pangyohari is cerebrum, and that would really line up with Tetrocosmos. Now, looking at the substance that I created of harmoniary, it's interesting that that lines up with Astrolocuzone and Mesocosmos, all planets, because the planets are in the emotional realm. And then Exiohari would match up with Macrocosmos, which is all of the galaxies, which is also interesting. So one would think that in the food octave, you've got the stomach to the Exiohari, and yet in the cosmoses, you've got the Protocosmos to the galaxies. So now we get to the concept of harmoniary. My amazing revelation of harmoniary shows how work on oneself is achieved between the cerebrum at position soul and harmoniary at position law, according to my adjustment, is the intentionally actualized midline, or to those who want to use the original word, Hanal Ut. It is said that impartiality is necessary at this point to change the path of the ascending energies, but it is more than that. The cerebrum is capable of triggering a hormonal reaction that can feed either the sexual organs at T or be used to turn Exiohari at T into a higher substance that goes to feed the Kestjanian body and the soul. Since it is a hormonal reaction, it validates the concept of distinguishing between selfish love and agape love, which was the principle of the early Christian church. Agape love is love that is not love that expects a reward, but love that is without egotistical motive. This is what Jesus taught Peter in John 21:15-17. The endocrine system is a very underrated system. It is, after all, responsible for the most exalted feeling of being in love. It has a memory, and thus it remembers good and bad emotional experiences. The concept of intentional suffering is being able to rise above both the bad and the good, and to harness this energy, wave into troughs and crests towards the vivifying of Exiohari, to feed the Kashjanian body and the soul. The soul itself must still advance by objective reason. The work at the relocated intentional actualized middle-end is to divert some of the energies of a hormonal system to create a physical being that will live on when you die, or an ethereal being that is your eternal soul. And it is very interesting that Gurdjieff inadvertently left out this key. So this is the end of my first lecture, and I hope you have given me a pass on a lot of my mispronunciations of these different substances. But in any case, it is the gist of it, and I hope that it will be of help to you.